Global warming. Who is to blame? Part 1. The first fire. The story of global warming does not begin in laboratories or United Nations summits. It begins much earlier when the first human placed a branch into the fire not just for warmth, but for transformation. Tens of thousands of years ago, fire became the first tool humans used to change their environment on a large scale. Forests were burned to drive out animals, create fields, and clear land. Entire ecosystems were transformed with nothing more than a spark and patience. This was not yet industry, but it was the start of the Anthropocene, the era when humans became a geological force. For centuries, the balance between human ambition and nature's limits remained fragile but relatively stable. People built empires, cleared valleys, rose and fell, but their impact, although dramatic locally, did not yet tip the planetary scale. That changed in the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution marked not only a technological shift, but also a philosophical one. Nature was no longer seen as a partner or threat. It became a resource to dominate. Coal, black stone that burned hot and long, became the fuel of the New World. Entire landscapes in England, then across Europe and America, were hollowed out to feed machines. By the 19th century, steamships crossed oceans, factories smoked over every major city, and railroads stitched continents together. With them came an invisible trail. Carbon dioxide, no one saw it. No one measured it. But it began to accumulate. In 1856, American scientist Eunice Newton Foote, long before her male counterparts, discovered that trapped heat. Her findings were largely ignored. A few decades later, Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius predicted that burning fossil fuels could warm the planet. He saw it as a distant, even beneficial future. At the time, no one imagined that by the 21st century, the consequences of those fires would reshape coastlines, flood cities, turn fertile lands into deserts, and force entire nations to reconsider their very survival. But the path was already paved. What began as survival became growth. What began as invention became extraction. The fire that once cooked meals now fueled megacities, highways, and data centers. And always, silently, it left behind carbon. By the end of the 20th century, the signal had become undeniable. Year after year, scientists observed a rise in global average temperatures. At first, a few tenths of a degree, then more. Oceans warmed. Ice caps thinned. Coral reefs bleached. Weather patterns grew erratic. And still, growth continued. Airlines doubled routes. SUVs became symbols of success. Suburbs sprawled and energy use soared. Politicians promised solutions, often decades away. Fossil fuel companies financed out. Meanwhile, the planet entered what scientists now call the Great Acceleration. In this acceleration, every metric, co-concentration, ocean acidity, species extinction, deforestation, energy use, grew at exponential rates. Earth's systems began to respond, and not gradually. Floods in Jakarta, fires in California, droughts in Africa, heat waves in Europe, hurricanes battering the Gulf Coast. Each year, records were not just broken, they were shattered. And the question became clear. Not, is the planet warming? But rather, who is responsible and what happens next? Part 2. The carbon clock. To understand who is to blame, it is necessary to examine the timeline, not in years or centuries alone, but in the carbon that accumulated with each choice made. Carbon became the ledger of human history, a silent accountant of every burned forest, every gallon of fuel, every flight taken. From 1750 to 1850, the world emitted relatively little CO. But by the late 19th century, emissions began to rise steadily. Coal had become the engine of industrial growth in Europe and North America. Cities expanded. Mines deepened. Trains roared across landscapes that had once been wilderness. The 20th century, however, was the true inflection point. Especially after World War II, economic recovery led to a surge in energy use. Factories multiplied. Suburban development exploded. Highways dissected entire regions. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas powered this boom. Between 1950 and 2020, over 1.5 trillion tons of coal were released into the atmosphere, more than in all previous human history combined. The carbon clock had begun to tick faster and faster. By the 1980s, scientists were raising the alarm with greater urgency. Institutions like NASA, the National Academy of Sciences, and the United Nations sounded increasingly direct warnings. The world was warming, and humans were the cause. And yet, emissions kept growing. Why? Because fossil fuels were no longer just energy. They were power, political power, military power, corporate power. Oil funded nations and made others vulnerable. The supply chains of the global economy became interwoven with diesel, gasoline, coal, and natural gas. To reduce emissions meant rethinking everything, from how cities were built to how people commuted, ate, and worked. Moreover, the narrative of freedom and prosperity, especially in the post-war United States, became tied to consumption. Bigger homes, bigger cars, endless air conditioning, air travel for leisure. Plastic wrapped everything. The American dream, exported across the world, was carbon-intensive at its core. At the same time, the Global South, nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, were told to develop but with fewer emissions. Yet these countries had emitted almost nothing during the critical centuries of industrial buildup. By 2000, a deep climate injustice had formed. Those who caused the least damage were suffering the most from rising seas, crop failures, and heat waves exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, fossil fuel companies, led by giants like Exxon, Shell, and BP, had known the truth. Internal documents, uncovered decades later, revealed that their scientists predicted global warming with stunning accuracy, as early as the 1970s. But instead of acting, they launched misinformation campaigns, questioning the science, funding climate denial groups, and sowing public doubt. They hired the same strategists who once worked for Big Tobacco. And so the carbon clock kept ticking. The 21st century began with declarations. The Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, net zero pledges, climate summits with strong words and softer actions. The gap between rhetoric and reality grew. By 2020, atmospheric CO had reached 415 parts per million, far above pre-industrial levels of 280. This was not just a statistic. It was the weight of choices made and deferred by generations. Each part per million was the echo of decisions made by boardrooms, parliaments, consumers, and markets. Some were complicit. Others just caught in a system too large to fight alone. But the total was undeniable. The Earth was warming, and there were names, dates, industries, ideologies, and systems that made it so. Part 3. The warming planet. By the time climate change had entered public discourse in the 1980s, the planet had already changed. What seemed like a distant problem, something for the late 21st century, was already underway. Earth's temperature had risen by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. It was not a number one could feel in a single day. But across decades and across continents, it reshaped everything. Glaciers began to retreat. Snowpacks melted earlier in the year. The Arctic, once locked in ice year-round, saw record-breaking summer melts. Polar bears struggled to find hunting grounds. Indigenous communities lost not just territory, but knowledge passed down for generations, tied to frozen seasons that no longer came. Oceans, absorbing more than 90% of excess heat, warmed dramatically. Coral reefs, biodiversity treasure troves, suffered mass bleaching events. In Australia, the Great Barrier Reef lost more than half of its coral between 1995 and 2020. Sea levels rose over 8 inches since 1900, a shift that may sound small, but for low-lying island nations and coastal cities, it meant increased flooding, eroding shorelines, salt intrusion into farmland, and eventually forced migration. And then came the heat. Cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas broke record after record. In India, temperatures reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. In Canada, a small town in British Columbia hit 121 degrees Fahrenheit and then burned to the ground in a wildfire days later. These were not outliers. They were signals. In California, fire season became fire year. Droughts deepened across the American West. The Amazon rainforest, once the world's greatest carbon sink, began emitting more carbon than it absorbed, a shift scientists had feared for decades. Extreme weather accelerated. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a wake-up call, but by 2020 it had been followed by Harvey, Maria, Irma, Ian, names no longer just storms, but symbols of vulnerability. Storm surges swallowed neighborhoods. Power grids collapsed. Recovery efforts cost hundreds of billions, and the toll on human life and stability was immeasurable. And behind each event, the science solidified. This was not just weather. It was climate, a pattern shaped by warming oceans, shifting jet streams, and atmospheric destabilization. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC, NASA, NOAA, and hundreds of climate scientists drew increasingly direct connections between fossil fuel emissions and the planet's chaotic response. Yet the broader system struggled to respond. Insurance markets began to break down in fire-prone areas. Farmers faced crop failures as planting seasons shifted. Climate refugees began to cross borders, slowly but steadily. And in many democracies, political polarization made climate policy a battleground instead of a bridge. Meanwhile, global co-emissions, after a brief dip during the COVID-19 pandemic, resumed their upward climb. This was not just an environmental crisis. It was geopolitical, economic, cultural, and existential. And yet, the warming planet continued to rotate day after day under a sun that now pressed harder than ever before. Part 4. The System That Burns. By the 21st century, climate change was no longer simply the result of individual actions or even isolated national policies. It had become systemic, deeply embedded in the global economic order, financial institutions, trade agreements, and consumption patterns. Fossil fuels were not just commodities, they were the bedrock of global civilization. Oil-powered transportation, fertilized crops, and created plastics. Coal and natural gas generated the electricity behind nearly every light bulb, screen, and device. For over a century, industrial and financial growth had been wedded to the combustion of carbon. Removing this foundation, or even reducing it, meant altering the most powerful structures in the world. Supply chains, built for speed and efficiency, were carbon-intensive from beginning to end. Ships the size of skyscrapers burned bunker fuel across oceans. Warehouses demanded constant cooling. Truck fleets crisscrossed continents daily. And consumers, particularly in wealthy nations, expected next-day delivery regardless of environmental cost. The global financial system mirrored this logic. Banks lent to oil and gas projects. Pension funds invested in fossil fuel portfolios. Insurance companies underwrote drilling operations. Even universities and religious institutions, long associated with progressive values, often held shares in carbon-heavy industries through complex endowments and trusts. Meanwhile, governments subsidized fossil fuel production with staggering sums. In 2022 alone, the International Monetary Fund estimated that the world spent nearly $7 trillion on explicit and implicit fossil fuel subsidies. These weren't just in developing countries. The United States, Canada, China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia were among the biggest contributors. These subsidies lowered prices at the pump, reduced electricity bills, and kept large industries globally competitive. But they also locked the world into a path of continued emissions. At the heart of the system lay an uncomfortable paradox. Growth was equated with success, and emissions with growth. GDP rose when construction boomed, flights increased, and consumption surged, even if that growth exacerbated planetary instability. Attempts to measure green or sustainable growth were often compromised by the sheer inertia of the carbon economy. Political leaders, even those who acknowledged the climate crisis, faced an impossible triangle: maintain economic growth, ensure energy security, and reduce emissions, all at the same time. When these goals conflicted, emissions reduction usually came last. In emerging economies, the dilemma was even more acute. Countries like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Brazil, home to billions, had every right to raise living standards. Yet doing so under the current model meant increased fossil fuel use, just as the window for climate action narrowed. This created a form of climate double jeopardy. Those least responsible for past emissions faced the greatest burden in limiting future ones. Technology promised an escape route: solar panels, wind farms, electric cars, carbon capture. But these solutions, while crucial, were not magic. They required rare minerals, massive investments, stable grids, and, above all, time. And time was running out. The system continued to burn because it was designed to, not maliciously, not even consciously, but as the logical endpoint of centuries of choices where short-term benefit outweighed long-term consequence. The warming world was not a glitch. It was the result of a global operating system running exactly as it was coded. Part 5. The human cost. The numbers were staggering: trillions of dollars in damage, hundreds of billions in recovery, millions displaced. But behind each statistic was a human story: a home lost, a harvest ruined, a future clouded by uncertainty. As the planet warmed, it did not do so evenly. Heat waves scorched urban centers with deadly intensity. Elderly residents in poorly ventilated apartments, outdoor workers with little legal protection, children in schools without air conditioning all became frontline victims of a shifting climate. In Phoenix, Arizona, the number of days above 110 degrees Fahrenheit climbed steadily. Emergency rooms reported rising cases of heat stroke. Construction companies began altering work hours. And still, the city expanded into the desert, into risk. In Bangladesh, monsoon rains grew less predictable. When they often came too fast. Rivers breached their banks. Homes built of bamboo and tin could not hold. Millions lived at the mercy of waters that arrived early, late, or not at all. In the Sahel region of Africa, rainfall declined over decades. Entire villages uprooted. Farmers became migrants. Children walked farther each year for water. Hunger, already a challenge, deepened as the land dried. Climate change did not create injustice. It magnified it. Women in developing nations bore disproportionate burdens: walking hours for water, managing households in drought, being last to eat in times of scarcity. Indigenous communities faced existential threats as their ancestral lands became uninhabitable. In small island nations like Kiribati or Tuvalu, sea level rise meant not just relocation, but cultural erasure. Even in wealthy countries, the divide was clear. After Hurricane Harvey inundated Houston in 2017, the damage was vast. But recovery followed predictable patterns. Wealthier neighborhoods rebuilt faster, aided by insurance and political clout. Poorer, largely minority communities, already living in flood-prone areas, were left waiting. Some never fully recovered. Climate migration began quietly, then accelerated. Fishermen in Central America abandoned the coasts. Farmers in Syria, faced with years of drought, moved to crowded cities. In the United States, climate havens like Duluth, Minnesota, or Buffalo, New York, began appearing on real estate shortlists. The movement of people due to climate stress, already measured in tens of millions, was forecasted to reach over 200 million by 2050. Each person carried not just belongings, but trauma, memory, and the silent question, why us? And through it all, young people began to see the future not as a canvas of possibility, but a battleground. School strikes erupted across continents. Lawsuits were filed against governments and oil companies. Climate anxiety, a new psychological term, became widespread among the under 30 generation. They had inherited a warming world, and they were beginning to ask why. Not just scientifically, not just economically, but morally. Who allowed this to happen? Who profited? And what would justice look like in a world already changed? Part 6. The illusion of distance. For decades, the climate crisis was framed as a problem of the future, something that would affect later generations or distant countries. That framing became one of the most damaging narratives of the 20th and early 21st centuries. It allowed powerful actors to delay. It justified half measures. It lulled societies into believing they had time when, in truth, the crisis was already here. Wildfires in California, Oregon, and Washington turned skies orange and released toxic smoke that drifted thousands of miles. Insurance companies began to pull out of high-risk areas. Homeowners found themselves unable to rebuild, not because of fire, but because of policy. In Florida, rising sea levels combined with king tides to flood streets even on sunny days. Salt water pushed through storm drains. Miami, a city built on porous limestone, began to install expensive pumping systems just to keep neighborhoods dry. Real estate values subtly shifted as buyers began to factor elevation into their decisions. Even the wealthy were not immune. In Malibu, California, multi-million-dollar homes were consumed by firestorms fueled by drought and wind. In Lake Charles, Louisiana, successive hurricanes battered the same city in the same season. In Texas, a winter storm in 2021 crippled the electrical grid, leaving millions freezing in homes not built for extreme cold. Climate change, long treated as a background issue, was becoming personal. The illusion that one could insulate themselves through wealth, location, or denial was crumbling. No fortress was fireproof. No city was beyond the reach of drought, flood, or storm. And no market, no matter how diversified, could ignore the costs. Insurance premiums rose. Mortgage lenders began to flag properties at risk from climate impacts. Municipal bonds, long considered safe, were downgraded in vulnerable areas. A new economic reality emerged. Climate risk was now financial risk. Meanwhile, culture began to shift. Climate fiction became a genre. Documentaries topped streaming charts. Once skeptical media outlets ran special coverage sections. Universities offered entire degrees in climate science, policy, and adaptation. But the urgency remained outpaced by inertia. Air travel rebounded after the pandemic. SUV sales climbed. Crypto mining consumed staggering amounts of electricity. In some countries, new coal plants were still being approved, even as existing ones pushed emissions beyond safe limits. And through it all, the carbon clock ticked on. The illusion of distance had been comforting, but fatal. Climate change was no longer tomorrow's problem. It was the architecture of today. Part 7. The battle over truth. As the climate crisis intensified, so did the battle over its narrative. Information and misinformation became one of the most powerful forces shaping how societies responded, resisted, or remained paralyzed. Science was clear. Reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC, NASA, NOAA, and thousands of peer-reviewed studies converged on the same conclusion. The Earth was warming rapidly due to human activity, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. The evidence was overwhelming: rising temperatures, retreating ice, acidifying oceans, shifting ecosystems. But clarity did not guarantee consensus. Powerful interests, especially those tied to oil, gas, and coal, had spent decades casting doubt. In the 1980s and 1990s, major fossil fuel companies privately accepted the science of climate change, while publicly funding campaigns to obscure it. Think tanks, PR firms, and political lobbies sowed confusion. They emphasized uncertainty, questioned motives, and reframed the debate as a clash of ideologies rather than data. The goal was not to win the scientific argument. It was to delay. And delay worked. Public opinion, especially in the United States, became polarized. In Europe, climate denial existed but was more marginal. In parts of Asia, the issue was framed through development and equity. But in the US, a uniquely entrenched skepticism took root, especially among conservative circles, not because the science was less clear, but because the solutions challenged deeply held economic and political assumptions. If addressing climate change meant regulating corporations, shifting energy systems, or acknowledging historical injustices, then many preferred to reject the problem altogether. Media played a dual role. Some platforms amplified the science. Others gave false balance, inviting climate deniers to debate researchers as if both sides had equal merit. This false equivalence stalled progress. Meanwhile, social media turbocharged disinformation, allowing fringe theories to spread globally in minutes. Algorithms favored outrage. Bots and trolls, some state-sponsored, flooded platforms with climate hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and attacks on scientists. Public trust eroded. Facts became optional. But resistance to truth was not limited to denial. There were also those who accepted the science and still did nothing. Governments pledged bold targets at global climate conferences, only to approve new drilling projects months later. Corporations announced net zero goals while quietly lobbying against emissions regulations. Greenwashing became a common corporate strategy, using eco-friendly language without making meaningful changes. This erosion of credibility damaged not just trust in institutions, but in the possibility of collective action. For many, climate fatigue set in. The problem seemed too big, too political, too entrenched. People tuned out. Others turned inward, focusing on personal sustainability while doubting the system would ever change. But amid this confusion, a new generation emerged. They grew up with climate education in schools, wildfire smoke in their lungs, and protest signs in their hands. They were digital natives, fluent in platforms, networks, and global organizing. And they weren't waiting for permission. Their voices pierced through the noise. They didn't just ask for action. They demanded accountability. Not just from governments, but from the industries and individuals who had knowingly prolonged the crisis. The battle over truth was not over. But the ground beneath it was shifting. Part 8. Technologies of Hope or Illusion? In a world already disrupted by climate change, technology became both a beacon of hope and a battleground of skepticism. It promised salvation, cleaner energy, carbon removal, resilient infrastructure, but also carried the risk of distraction, delay, and deepening inequity. The 21st century saw dramatic advances in renewable energy. Solar panels dropped in price by more than 90% since 2010. Wind power expanded across plains and coastlines. Battery storage, once a major bottleneck, became viable for homes, businesses, and electric grids. Countries like Denmark, Portugal, and parts of Germany ran days, even weeks, entirely on renewable electricity. California and Texas, often ideological opposites, both saw surges in wind and solar deployment. Cities across the globe adopted ambitious decarbonization plans. Electric vehicles (EVs) moved from luxury to mainstream. Tesla, once niche, became one of the world's most valuable companies. Legacy automakers rushed to catch up, unveiling EV fleets and phasing out internal combustion engines. Charging infrastructure expanded. Incentives multiplied. But the green transition was uneven. In developing nations, access to capital, stable grids, and rare earth materials made renewables harder to deploy. Solar panels required minerals like lithium and cobalt, often mined under harsh, exploitative conditions. Wind farms clashed with land use, indigenous rights, and biodiversity concerns. And electric vehicles remained inaccessible to billions. Meanwhile, a new frontier emerged: carbon capture and storage (CCS), direct air capture, and geoengineering. CCS aimed to trap emissions before they reach the atmosphere, storing them underground. Direct air capture, more ambitious, sought to vacuum from ambient air. Companies branded themselves as carbon negative, while airlines offered offsets based on captured or planted carbon. Geoengineering took it further. Some scientists proposed injecting aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight, mimicking volcanic eruptions. Others studied marine cloud brightening or ocean fertilization to absorb more carbon. Supporters called it Plan B, essential given the slow pace of emissions cuts. Critics saw it as a dangerous gamble. They warned of moral hazard, that faith in future tech would justify current inaction. They pointed to ecological risks, geopolitical tensions, and unintended consequences. Most of all, they questioned the wisdom of treating the climate, Earth's most complex system, as a machine to be hacked. Even clean tech had a footprint. Solar farms required land. Wind turbines altered landscapes. Battery production was energy intensive. Recycling challenges loomed. And in the background, fossil fuel giants invested in renewables, not always to transition, but to maintain influence. Hope, it seemed, came with caveats. But the question was not whether technology would help, it already was. The question was, whose technology for whose benefit at whose cost? Would clean energy empower marginalized communities or replicate old patterns of exploitation? Would solutions be shared or hoarded? Would climate tech become another tool for profit or a vehicle for justice? These questions remained unanswered, but they would shape the trajectory of the next decades. Because technology was not just hardware. It was politics, ethics, and vision. And the future it built depended not just on what we could invent, but what we chose to value. Part 9. Reckoning. By the late 21st century's second decade, the world stood on a precipice, not only environmental, but moral. The science had matured. The impacts were undeniable. The technologies were available. What remained was will. The climate crisis was never simply about carbon or heat. It was about power, who held it, how it was used, and who bore the consequences. The question of blame was not just academic. It carried weight in negotiations, policy, and justice. Historical responsibility could not be ignored. The United States, Europe, Russia, and later China had pumped the majority of emissions into the atmosphere since the dawn of the industrial era. Their growth was built on coal, oil, and gas extracted from colonized lands, refined in factories, and consumed with little concern for global consequence. Developing nations, those least responsible and most vulnerable, began to demand climate reparations, not charity, but accountability. At global summits, the term loss and damage entered formal frameworks. Countries ravaged by storms and droughts wanted more than promises. They wanted restitution. Some funds were created, some debts acknowledged, but progress was slow, uneven, and often symbolic. In courtrooms around the world, a new form of reckoning began. Youth activists sued governments for violating their right to a livable future. Indigenous communities challenged corporations over deforestation, oil spills, and poisoned water. Climate litigation multiplied. Some cases were won, precedents were set, but many dragged on for years, bogged down in legal complexity. In boardrooms, pressure mounted. Shareholders demanded climate disclosures. Fossil fuel executives were grilled before parliaments. Greenwashing scandals triggered resignations. But change, real, structural change, remained elusive. And yet, beneath the surface, something shifted. Cities began rethinking their designs, building for heat, water, and equity. Citizens turned front lawns into gardens. Rivers long buried under concrete were restored. Indigenous land management practices, once dismissed, were rediscovered and respected. Some governments embraced radical climate policy, phasing out fossil fuels, subsidizing transitions, taxing carbon, and banning destructive industries. Not as PR moves, but as acts of survival. Culture evolved. Climate was no longer a topic. It was woven into architecture, art, cuisine, education, urban planning, and even spirituality. The crisis stopped being abstract. It became the lens through which life was understood. The question shifted from who is to blame to who is responsible now. Blame pointed backward. Responsibility looked forward. No single solution existed. There would be no moment of global victory, no singular policy or summit that solved the climate crisis. But there could be thresholds, points at which the arc bent toward resilience, regeneration, and justice. Whether humanity would cross those thresholds remained uncertain. But one truth had become clear. The atmosphere held the memory of centuries. And every choice by nations, corporations, communities, and individuals was now etched into that memory. Not metaphorically. Literally. In parts per million. In degrees Fahrenheit. In futures gained or lost. Epilogue. The question that remains: who is to blame? The answer is long, layered, and undeniable. But perhaps a better question, the one history will ask, is: when the full weight of the crisis was known, who chose to act? Let us know what you think in the comments.